Good morning. I'm indeed delighted to address you all one more time, apropos the State of the Union, centric to defense economics. And as you all could have easily deciphered, this is an area of seminal national significations with international ramifications, an area of great concern, perhaps an area of darkness as well, because many facets of defense economics are yet to be uncovered. It is with certitude my endeavor to provide for clarity in a complex world, and towards that objective I shall engage myself perspicaciously in delivering this speech. Well, it all began way back in 1990 when I was a graduate student in the United States, and as you all may recall, the world was witness perhaps to the first televised war, the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, and literally we had a ball-by-ball account of whatever was happening. I had just completed a course in advanced macroeconomic analysis, and I was bewildered no end to witness multiple markets react adversely. As a corollary, there was a flight of capital to the bond markets, and even to safer commodities like gold. But one thing was for certain: the fluctuations which I witnessed across multiple markets and geographies was unprecedented. In fact, shortly after the war, in a very, very well-researched report, the Arab Monetary Fund pegged the cost at US dollars 620 billion, a staggering amount by any standards. And 2 years later, 1992, the New York Times brought out another well-researched article which reiterated on the $620 billion number. Now, just to put things in perspective, in early 1993, the World Bank defrayed an amount which is far, far less than $620 billion in sub-Saharan Africa for the food verticals. And by early 1993, the results were there for all to see. So fundamentally, my interest in defense economics was kindled no end. And in fact, I collected information for almost 30 years. In 2015 and 16, I did an analysis of two of the largest democracies in the world, the defense economics of two of the largest democracies in the world, the United States and India. Suffice to state that this narrative is about the defense economics of India. And whilst doing that analysis, I just did an examination. Had the $620 billion been invested in sub-Saharan Africa in 1993, what would we have seen? And lo and behold, by 1997, we would have seen all-round development in four major verticals: infrastructure, health, education, and food. This would have led to substantive development. Sub-Saharan Africa would have been the envy of the rest of the world, and would have got to a robust level of economic standards, wherein the platform would have been created for future growth and enormous possibility. So the bottom line being that wars cost a humongous lot of money, and if for nothing else, only for this reason, we really require global peace. Anyways, as I just mentioned, my interest was kindled no end, and I started in right earnest by literally collecting all the data on a periodical basis, examining them meticulously till 2015, when I started analyzing and examining them in depth. And the narrative as far as India goes would essentially, quintessentially be in three parts. The first part would be the economic underpinnings of India for the 70-year period I researched, 1947 to 2017. And then the defense economics per se, and finally the albatrosses and solutions. Now let's begin with 1947. In circa 1947, when India attained her independence, the first Prime Minister of India, Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, inherited an economic mess, an unprecedented situation with severe restraints and constraints. And in fact, the hindsight 2020 analysis at that time would have revealed something very obvious, that for 150 years prior to independence, the British had looted us by the day and committed highway robbery by the night, invested nothing back into the Indian infrastructure system, and to add insult to injury, at the time of partition, we had to pay Pakistan what was then a whopping amount of money. As an addendum, I would like to state that in the first half of the last century, 1900-1950, there were several areas of India suffered from drought. We had the Great Bengal famine, civil unrest in many places. The net result was India was an economic nightmare. It was in this milieu that Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru became the Prime Minister of Free India. Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru was an outlier. In fact, I must say at the very outset that the Prime Minister's office in India came into being only with Lal Bahadur Shastri, his successor. Pandit Nehru was a man of enormous wisdom and perspicacity, and worked with certitude to achieve what would be in India's highest and best interests. So the first thing he did was to analyze the various models which could be used for India. A lot has been said about this. In fact, there have been serious commentators who have said that it was on the word of Harold Lasky at the London School of Economics that he adopted the model of Fabian socialism for India, and so on and so forth. There has been a lot of criticism as well. But Pandit Nehru, after analyzing and observing the various models which could be effectuated on, chose Fabian socialism because of India's constraints and restraints, and the overriding objective of the founding fathers of India to effectuate on welfarism and eventuate on land reforms and other progressive measures which would provide for an egalitarian society. Now actually, this is one of the reasons why Pakistan did not want independence. Jinnah, rather Muhammad Ali Jinnah did not want independence because, Pakistan as it exists even today is basically in the hands of a few feudal lords. And certainly they would not have wanted land reforms of any kind. Pandit Nehru, Mahatma Gandhi, Dr. Ambedkar, and a host of Indian leaders wanted India to be an egalitarian state, wanted India to have food, clothing and shelter for all its citizens, and wanted to have an equitable order. So, and when he realized this massive amounts of constraints and restraints, he went in for Fabian socialism. When I did an analysis in 2015, I figured out that hindsight 2020, this was probably the best model he could have adopted. And what is Fabian socialism? Fabian socialism is characterized by four coordinates: centralized planning, the massive presence of public sector undertakings, high levels of taxation, high levels of regulation. Literally from circa 1947 to 1991 we had Fabian socialism, 1991 to 2014 we had liberalization, and 2014 onwards we had laissez-faire. We are in fact in the grips of laissez-faire economic policy. Now I will discuss Fabian socialism, liberalization, and laissez-faire economics under the rubric of these four coordinates which characterize Fabian socialism, as would be very meaningful and significant for this narrative and to understand the economic underpinnings of India. So, in keeping with this laudable objective of effectuating on Fabian socialism, the core coordinate was on centralized planning, and the Prime Minister incubated the Planning Commission of India with Jawaharlal Nehru himself became the chairman of the Planning Commission, and after a meticulous headhunting exercise, he chose Sir V.T. Krishnamacharya as the vice chairman of the Planning Commission, simply because Sir V.T. Krishnamacharya had been, and very successfully at that, the Prime Minister of Baroda and the Prime Minister of Jaipur, princely states of India, and I was a member of the Constituent Assembly. In fact, there were at least 5 reports at the time of independence where certain international bodies had conducted surveys and examined India's economic development under the princely states, and of course, when the British were ruling India, and they found that the Baroda model of economic governance was the best. In fact, in 1944, the citizens of Baroda had awarded Sir V.T. Krishnamacharya with a very coveted prize for the economic stewardship he had provided for as the Diwan of Baroda. And rightly so, Pandit Nehru chose him to be the vice chairman, and the overriding emphasis was on effectuating on welfareism per se. The first 3 plans, 15 years, were all dovetailed towards agriculture, agricultural reform, warehousing, infrastructure, rural roads, the building of dams, and then it moved on into ports, and then in the third plan we had an emphasis on post and telegraphs, what telecom was called then, and the fundamental point was Panditji wanted to achieve egalitarianism and provide for an equitable order via the rubric of Fabian socialism, so as to bring forth welfareism in reality. And to that extent, he worked very hard and zealously. And I have to mention here that under the stewardship of Prime Minister Nehru, the 3 branches of government literally worked in unison. The Supreme Court was aggressive in terms of land reform, be it Sajjan Singh. Most of the Supreme Court orders at that time were upheld land reform. The executive, in fact, every finance minister from starting with R.K. Shanmugam Shetty worked very hard to effectuate the objectives of the Planning Commission. Every year the finance bill was reflective of that. Literally, the period from 1947 to 64, India worked in unison. And Pandit Nehru, of course, was a legendary leader who always caucused with the opposition leaders before taking any major policy decision. And it worked out very well for India at that point in time, given the fact that we had huge restraints and constraints. After the sad passing away of Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, we had Lal Bahadur Shastri for a brief period, who continued with the work of Fabian socialism, and Mrs. Gandhi took it to the next level because she had political compulsions as well. For a brief period, she was supported by the communists, and so she had to, accept some of their suggestions, and also she had an overriding emphasis on the eradication of poverty. After a sad assassination, Rajiv Gandhi continued in the same work, but he realized that India does require to industrialize even at the level of the private sector, and the baby steps of liberalization were taken during the stewardship of Rajiv Gandhi. In fact, he encouraged collaborations and so on and so forth. Then, of course, due to the economic exigencies of the day, we had the legendary P.V. Narasimha Rao coming in as the Prime Minister of India, who effectuated on liberalization, and the plans in effect spoke about freer markets. This was brilliantly built on by the Prime Minister, the next Prime Minister, Atal Bihari Vajpayee, who had an emphasis on infrastructure to protect liberalization and to take it to the next level. It was done in such a wonderful way that India's growth happened to get enhanced in a dramatic manner. And after the well, though India was shining, politics is politics, and after the electoral loss of the Bharatiya Janata Party, we had Prime Minister Manmohan Singh take over for 10 years, who continued with the genre of liberalization and brought in the catchphrase of inclusive growth. And they continued in his second term as well, till Prime Minister Modi came in with laissez-faire, and with laissez-faire the emphasis was on smaller governments and freer markets. In effect, what has happened is that from an emphasis on aggregate demand under Pandit Nehru, under Prime Minister Modi, the emphasis is now on aggregate supply. In other words, the factors of production which were totally controlled, or where the government had a large say during the time of Pandit Nehru, progressively has moved to a situation where eventually private sector will have a greater say vis-a-vis the control of the factors of production. Now to the second coordinate, which is the PSUs. Prime Minister Nehru realized that India required to have a large number of PSUs, and this was very much in keeping with the ideation of J.M. Keynes. I have to mention something here, and this is that something to do with theoretical economics, and of course it has a major academic component as well. The fundamental truth of the matter is that scores of Indian economists, generations of Indian economists have been schooled under the ideation of John Maynard Keynes. John Maynard Keynes had an emphasis on aggregate demand. His most popular concept was interventionism, wherein he stated that if governments were to intervene, especially during the times of wars, it would lead to employment and therefore to greater levels of disposable income and aggregate demand. This was his fundamental equation, and Pandit Nehru realized that India does require to provide for employment, and the PSUs were a perfect method of delivery for such purposes. Therefore, Pandit Nehru worked towards the creation of many PSUs. In fact, in terms of defense, the HAL and some of our iconic PSUs were created at that time, or they were taken to the next level. Many of the ordnance factories were incubated. Today we have over 43, and pretty much it was, the ideation of J.M. Keynes fit into the Fabian socialism school of thought very well. And then during the time of Mrs. Gandhi, she continued with it, and so did Rajiv Gandhi. Rajiv Gandhi realized that PSUs are very important as they play a pivotal role in the economy. The genius of Narasimha Rao realized that PSUs had to be professionalized, and also at the same time, he realized that India can also unlock some money from these PSUs, and so he partially privatized it, which provided for odes of professionalism as well. And the brilliance of Vajpayee took it to the next level. Prime Minister Manmohan Singh did the same, and it continued in his second term. The second term was largely scam-tainted. And then, of course, Modi, with his emphasis on smaller governments, did work on this aggressively. Though it is not my remit, because this narrative is confined to 2017. After that, I've heard certain privatization initiatives wherein the government would disinvest over 51%. In my humble analysis, that is wrong. India does require to have a robust PSU system where 51% of the entities are owned by the government. The balance can be in private hands to enhance professionalism and to unlock wealth for the country. But under no circumstance can they get below 51%. Now, let me also say this. There was a lot of criticism when Pandit Nehru went in for Fabian socialism. Now, had Pandit Nehru not created all those PSUs, right from Manmohan Singh, we would not have anything to disinvest. So, there you go. Criticism was largely unfounded. So now moving on to the third coordinate, which is high levels of taxation. Right from the times of Pandit Nehru, we had almost over 90%, to Indira Gandhi, to Rajiv Gandhi was the one who realized that because private sector needs to be given a certain emphasis, we need to bring down the levels of taxation. In fact, his dream budget of 85 actually tapered it down. This precedent continued and is continued till today, wherein governments have realized that we have to bring down the levels of taxation. In fact, my seminal research in 2015 pointed to certain numbers which I will discuss as part of the albatrosses, and the fact of the matter remains that the economic history of India says that simply reveals that right from the 90% level it has come down drastically in 2017. Ejus dem generis in the regulations arena, wherein at that point in time in Fabian socialism we were totally controlled, and now with laissez-faire, lesser and lesser government control will be witnessed. In effect, just to reiterate, the factors of production which were either controlled or where the government had a huge say during the time of Fabian socialism, increasingly will see private sector participation, and the shift is from aggregate demand to aggregate supply, and clearly the emphasis is now on supply side economics or laissez-faire. So pretty much this is the economic narrative of India for a 70-year period. Now back to 1947. In the immediate aftermath of independence, there was a tribal invasion of India, a Pashtun invasion of India, backed by the vile and venal state of Pakistan, who for the 70-year period which I analyzed had one overriding objective: the destabilization of India per se. Anyway, India was able to handle that with the land, but Pandit Nehru immediately got thinking, and he commissioned the services of Professor Blackett, a Nobel laureate in physics, to strategize on India's weapon systems and acquisition programs. The professor, I should say, after a meticulous study, ideated in terms of a 5, 10, 15-year period vis-a-vis acquisition programs, and whilst doing so, in my very humble opinion, overshot his brief by stating that under no circumstance should India spend more than 2% of her GDP vis-a-vis defense acquisition programs. Now, this actually became an albatross, and I will discuss that later. Call it the law of unintended consequences or the ingenuity, quote-unquote, of our bureaucracy, but there were some issues which I will discuss later. Nonetheless, if you take the 70-year period and India's defense expenditure, barring the wars, after the Pashtun invasion, the 65 and 71 war with Pakistan, the Siachen issue under Rajiv Gandhi, the Kargil war under A.B. Vajpayee, the war with China in 62, and the Goa Liberation War. The immediate aftermath of these wars, India spiked her defense expenditure. It was most pronounced, I beg your pardon, after the Chinese aggression and after Siachen. And barring these periods, the rest we confined ourselves to less than 2%. In fact, excuse me, as an indicative archetype, the 10 years of Manmohan Singh, we spent less than 1.79, and likewise under Modi 1.0, it was under 1.79%. But the only thing which can be said is that under strict Fabian socialism, and all the restraints and constraints that Pandit Nehru inherited, we had a very paltry growth rate of around 3%, and then with Narasimha Rao, it started enhancing tremendously, went beyond 7.5%, 8%. Vajpayee took it to 8.5%. In fact, Rajiv Gandhi was the first person under his stewardship to take it beyond 4.5%, and then to quantum leap to 8.5%. So the amount we spent was more. That's all which can be said about this. Now, this was, the 2% rule was an albatross, which I will discuss later, but barring these periods, we confined, of the war, the immediate aftermath of the war, we confined ourselves to the sub 2% rule, 2 and less than that. Now, in 2015 and 16, I analyzed all the data which I had collected meticulously, and I clearly was able to decipher 11 albatrosses as far as India's defense economics go. In 2017 and 18, I documented that, and I wrote 36 articles which formed the anthology. Pretty much the findings of the anthology is what I'm discussing today. And when I did the analysis, I realized that these albatrosses can be handled provided we are perspicacious. For this narrative, I will confine myself to just four of the main albatrosses. The first two are theoretical, and the second two have tremendous pragmatic connotations. The four are GDP, the United Nations Security Council, the 2% rule, and corruption. Now the GDP, let's start with the GDP. To begin with, let's understand the GDP. The genesis of the GDP is simple. During the wars, the United States wanted to know of a yardstick by which they could measure the economy, and they hired the services of Professor Simon Kuznets to do it. The professor, after a detailed study, understood that the United States, which was then primarily driven by farm produce and manufacturing, he understood that the best yardstick would be that of a gross domestic product. It was perhaps true for that age, but today, in the Internet of Everything age, where some economies are over 95% dovetailed towards their service verticals, the GDP is clearly an albatross and a wrong indicator. I have to get nostalgic here, and I have to narrate two personal events here to reiterate the point. This is way back in October, November 1984, when I was in my final year of college in India, here at Vivekananda College in Chennai, where I started off with a bachelor's degree in commerce, and in the second year I realized that my predilections lay in the economic sciences. Luckily, we had a great economist who was also the principal of the college, who actually had the guest lectures going for us in terms of the money and banking. And so in those days, professors and academicians per se, even vice chancellors, were easily accessible. They were all there for serving the students and to help them to educate themselves well, bereft of any ego whatsoever. The entire reason, the raison d'etre of their existence was to share their knowledge. And so too with Professor Ganeshan, an iconic economist and academician. I met him outside the class. I told him, this is my predilection. He said, yes, you seem to be a bright fellow. This is a good area. Let me tell you this. And he spent the next 15 minutes explaining to me certain things, which indeed proved to be prophetic. He said, here, young man, just look at that. Outside our college, for the past few days, they have been digging some tunnels. Now, in fact, let me tell you this, the watchman told me that a few of the laborers were found drunk outside, sleeping outside our platform. There's a platform outside our college this morning. Anyways, that apart, see, those laborers, they get a wage. Now, is it reflective of the standard of living of this nation? Two, it's very obvious that the contractor who got that, it was, I think the telephones were doing some work. That contractor who got the job, there is a high degree of probability that he will grease the palms of the powers that are. And therefore, this would lead to the enrichment of a few, and therefore inequality will widen. And three, I just told you that a few of them were drunk. Now, who takes care of the additional health costs? And for the next 25 days, nobody will refill those tunnels. What happens to all the health costs in terms of all the students coming and going, and the ecological issues as well? Now, you see, my friend, the GDP as we know it does not reflect all this. So we have a wrong yardstick. So let's start with the basic premise. You can actually spend time researching on this and you will come up with something fascinating. All the best. A year later, I got really engrossed in economics and then moved to the United States and started studying economics. Luckily, I had a renowned professor teaching me. In fact, in the fall of '87, when I got to do advanced macroeconomic analysis under Professor Gilbert Ibner, a very distinguished professor who had been in the Council of Economic Advisors with President Ford, was chairman of the Philadelphia National Bank, was in the Federal Reserve, extremely distinguished professor who had been shortlisted for the Nobel Prize, was a colleague of Nobel laureate Lawrence Klein. When he realized that I had tremendous interest with his GDP, he spent a lot of time and then he came to the same conclusion. In fact, he said, Kishore, climate change factors are not incorporated into the GDP as we know today. Bingo. Two iconic professors who are far ahead of their times. And in 2011, the world became sensitized to it. In fact, France is the first intelligent nation to move beyond the GDP. They have a wellness index under François Macron. It was brought in place. And in fact, what they do is the 6 major macroeconomic markets are studied. The effects of the standard of living, inequality effects, health and climate change are factored into it. And then a composite number comes up. And then they have the wellness index, which is reflective of the state of the union with our economic verticals. That's the way to go about it, and India should follow suit. India should follow the French exemplar and get to a wellness index. Now, why is the GDP an albatross? Now, let me say this to you. I have to say something here about the economic sciences. You see, in the first half of the last century, 1900 to 1950, Professor Lionel Robbins, widely considered to be the father of the economic sciences, ideated that logical underpinnings have to drive economic thought and that math and stat can be used only as enabling tools. But somewhere in the 1950s and 60s in the United States, primarily in New England and Chicago, the Midwest, a whole bunch of wannabe and failed mathematicians got to the economic sciences and started cracking out all kinds of equations. So much so, 6 years ago when I was at a conference in India, after 2 days of listening to a mathematical economist, many of us were wondering what the economic content was after all those great equations he derived. Fundamentally, there was a lot of confusion. Now, there were a number of articles in the 70s and in fact in the 80s and even in the 60s of the GDP and for India's defense and so on and so forth, even in journals like the American Economic Review. The defense planners in India have used such papers to ideate on defense economics of India, to do the prognostics, and this is the reason why we've had every chief of staff and vice chief of staff who has testified before a parliamentary standing committee of defense saying very clearly that we require much more money apropos the defense verticals and that many of our equipment are obsolete. Now this is because the prognostics were fallacious. We need to get back to logical underpinnings, and just to reiterate the point, an incumbent government can make its performance look that much better by merely moving the base year in terms of GDP. Now we need to move away from the GDP because the GDP is clearly an albatross centric to economics per se, and I just cited a few articles wherein defense planners in India have blindly used it and to much adverse effect. The reality, which is what economics is supposed to convey, which is what economists have to work on. In fact, all the prognostics we do should eventually be juxtaposed with what actually happened, and there ought not to be a gap. Unfortunately, using some of the fancy fancied articles of the American Economic Review, we have not able to achieve any amount of realism. We've been far, far away from the truth. And in fact, even at the London School of Economics, from 92 to 95, there was a decisive research initiative wherein 12 people were taken as a sample survey. 6 were janitors, 6 were mathematical economics, and they were made to prognosticate every quarter on the 6 major macroeconomic coordinates. In 96, a paper came out, a working paper, wherein every quarter the janitors got it better than the mathematical economists. I'm not debunking math's role, but all I'm saying is we can't do away with pragmatism, and pragmatism is achieved only when we subscribe to logical underpinnings, but deductive reasoning, as simple as that. So we have to move away from the GDP, because the GDP is a wrong indicator and it has not served its purpose in terms of the defense prognostics of India, the defense economics and the prognostics which goes with it. So let's move on to the second albatross, which is in the realms of political economics. The United Nations Security Council, as we know it, is a feat because they are first among equals. It's run by a junta. 2 members of the United Nations Security Council have, since the time of Yahya Khan in Pakistan, funded Pakistan and have transferred technology, sometimes surreptitiously. This has created adverse consequences in India, and over almost a 50-60 year period, we have had to spend that much more on our defense verticals than what we would have spent provided if we had had a better neighbor. So I just started off this narrative with a $620 billion exemplar. Aegis done generous, had that extra money being spent on India's development. Even as early as the 70s, we would have achieved a considerable amount of welfareism. We would have been at a state where we would have been the envy of much of the developing world, because most of the welfare measures would have been implemented on. But unfortunately, because of the albatross of Pakistan, we have had to spend much more money on our defense verticals. Now, this has to change. Let's clearly understand here that there are 2 options. One, either India gets to be a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. India is a very mature nation. In fact, even the curious gallimaufry of people which ruled India from 89 to 91 would not have done anything, did not do anything adverse rather in terms of foreign policy. And likewise, we are a very mature nation when it comes to upholding ahimsa, the concept of ahimsa in foreign policy. Now, let's be very clear here that the precursor to the United Nations, the League of Nations, of which many princely states of India were signatories to, was built on the robust platform of an equitable world order, and it would have led to a multipolar world. It would not have created the first among equals, which we witness in the UN Security Council today. Here I have to again mention the greatness of Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. In my very humble opinion, the greatest contribution of Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru was in the realms of foreign policy. When he incubated the non-aligned movement, fortunately backstabbed by Gamal Abdul Nasser, the non-aligned movement, by its very definition, had regional economies and would have created an egalitarian world order. Equitableness would have been there, and no group of nations would have been able to drive anything at all from dominant positions. The United Nations Security Council could not have done many things which they have done had there been an egalitarian order. Just to put things in perspective, had 9/11, God forbid, had 9/11 happened in India, Committee 1540 would not have acted with the same verb. So we need to get an egalitarian order fast. We need to democratize the United Nations Security Council. India needs to be a member, or we need to do away with the the United Nations and incubate the non-aligned movement with great work across geographies and make it the living organization of the world, because we will by definition have egalitarianism. And in India's case, we will not have to spend so much money because of No nation, by definition, can patronize Pakistan as much as it has been patronized in the past. The third coordinate, the albatross, is about the 2% rule. The lower unintended consequences. Professor Blackett came up with the 2% rule, and I read his report meticulously, and his report was largely dovetailed to defense acquisitions and weapons initiatives. But we, of course, have a very quote-unquote creative bureaucracy who neatly tweaked the 2% rule to include human capital as well. Now, just to put things in perspective, in 2018, FY 2018, India spent demand for grants 4 lakh crores on defense verticals, out of which 1,29,000 crores was spent on human capital, and the balance was on capital acquisition programs. Now, for sure, Indian human capital in defense verticals are avant-garde. We have probably the best soldiers in the world. It has been said, given that a British general and an American weaponry, we'd be invincible. We need to spend on our human capital for sure, but there are sensible ways to do it. In fact, in 1959, a group of intellectuals grouped in Delhi, and they came up with the 3% rule, which largely coincided with what happened in 2018. 32% we spent on human capital, and the balance on capital acquisition. So we need to spend much more money, and that is the bottom line. Now, if we have perspicacity in our economic thinking, we can do it. Let me say this to you with a narrative from my research. In 2015, I did go through a questionnaire analysis of 4,000 citizens, 2,000 taxpayers and 2,000 non-taxpayers. The 2,000 taxpayers simply stated that if the tax rate were brought to the 15-18% slab, 100% compliance would be achieved. And the 2,000, all the 4,000, including 2,000 non-taxpayers, said that they were not averse to a slab rate, flat rate of 2,000 rupees a year per citizen towards India's defense and welfare account. When I did our revenue calculations based on FY 2015, I found that we get to 4.2 times the revenue what we got in 2015 FY, and that even if we had spent 1.5% of that, we would have spent, in actuality, we would have had 2.5 times more money which we could have expended in the defense verticals. We could have taken care of our capital requirements. We could have taken care very well of our human capital requirements, the salaries and pensions and so on and so forth, and still have excess which could have been kept into a contingency account. And the balance, of course, could have definitely gone in for welfareism, education, so on and so forth. Now, we've had terrible ideation in this matter. I just argued against the abuse of mathematics in economics. And we've had mathematical economists in this country who have actually gone on record saying that we need to do away with taxes. This would be voodoo economics, and this would hurt us very badly. This is what happens when we bring too much of math into play. We completely forget pragmatic underpinnings, which is so much a part of logical thinking. So we need to be perspicacious about economic thinking vis-a-vis raising of revenues, so that we do have all the money in the world to invest in our defense verticals, because when we do invest sensibly in our defense verticals, we definitely get to a very strong defense force, which is indeed a great offense. Now, the fourth albatross, and a concomitant of the third, is that we have witnessed rampant amounts of corruption in defense verticals, which have adversely affected our defense economics. Right from the 1948 cheap scandal effectuated by the Keralite B.K. Krishnaveni to Rufial, no deal has been seen to be above board. Every deal has come with a certain amount of corruption. A classified research initiative done in 2015 actually did not get much response. A few brave generals, of course, enunciated to me that the kickbacks are anywhere between 3 to 11%, 3% in high-end weapon systems, and 11% in revenue model issues like Stuttler deals, supply of uniforms, so on and so forth. Fundamentally, the truth of the matter, the naked truth of the matter is that corruption is endemic, apropos India's defense verticals. We need to do away with it, because by doing away with corruption, we would be in actuality, getting our money's worth, and it would also help us in defense preparedness, because corruption always brings about delay in procurement, so defense preparedness is compromised. Also, the defense companies would love it very much, because they'd only have to stick to professionalism and the quality of their equipment. Now, there is no better time than now to effectuate on the solutions which are we handling these 4 albatrosses, because the next genre of theatre combat is the military uses of outer space. And right here in India, at Thiruvananthapuram, we have one of the finest space organizations in the world, the Indian Space Research Organization, and provided they are well funded, we can send n number of military satellites up in space. India will get to a dominant position vis-a-vis defense, and that would be enabling, because it would lead to a large amount of macroeconomic expansion caused primarily by the peace and tranquility which is prevailing as a consequence of the dominant position we get due to defense prowess. And this could enable India to easily go past a $5 trillion economy in real terms, leading to a huge macroeconomic expansion, wherein not only defense but even vis-a-vis our welfare initiatives, India will be really one up in the game. Thank you so much. Everything what I've said is there in the anthology. Please read the anthology. My email is there as well. I'm happy to accept any mails from you. I'm happy to answer all the queries you may have. Thank you very much for the opportunity. Thank you very much for all of you to have come here, taken time off your busy schedules to come here. Jai Hind. Bharat Mata Ki Jai.